The first time I saw her, she was no more than a shadow in the half-light curled against the buckskin gelding, like she thought the stall walls could keep the world out. My breath hung white in the cold as I stepped inside, the barn's heat faint but welcome after the cutting wind outside. Her dress was torn, hair tangled, one bare shoulder showing through where the cloth had split. Brown eyes followed me without blinking, wide and wary. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. I stood there, one hand still on the door, wondering if she'd make it through the night without freezing where she lay. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever found yourself face to face with someone who might change the course of your days. I'm Jed Nolan, and I've worked the same stretch of land since I was 19. My father taught me to break a horse without breaking its spirit, to mend a fence before the gap widened, and to share what you could without making a show of it. We were not wealthy folks. Our worth lay in good neighbors, a dry roof, and a clean Sunday shirt for church. The seasons ran our lives, planting, calving, haying, and praying for rain when the dust came early. Money passed quick in town, but out here, you learned to make do with what your own two hands could keep together. 5 winters back, the cabin held more than one chair at the table. My wife Sarah had a laugh that could cut through the hardest day, and she was carrying our first child when the snow came heavy. They were both gone before the thaw, and after that, I let the place go quiet. Half the shelves sat empty, the bed too big for one man, and I kept to myself unless the stock needed selling or the weather drove me into town for salt and flour. It was easier to wear the days down slow than to ask for company I couldn't promise to keep. This country changes, though, whether you welcome it or not. The railroad men talk of lines cutting through the next valley, bringing strangers and noise. Land agents circle like hawks, offering dollars for pasture they've never set foot on. Folks I've known my whole life sell and move closer to the depot, chasing a different kind of living. I stayed put, even as the ridge roads grew quiet and the evenings stretched longer than they used to. It was in that stillness that I found her, huddled in my barn with the horses, the snowlight drifting in through the boards. I didn't know her name yet, or why she'd chosen my place over the miles of empty land between here and the nearest trail. But as I set the hay down and watched her from the corner of my eye, I could tell she was half-starved, half-frozen, and running from something that still had its hold on her. By the time I stepped back out into the cold, the question was already there, whether to let her stay or turn her toward the road before nightfall. And when I reached for the cabin door, I caught myself looking back at the barn, knowing I'd already made my choice. The snow had thickened by nightfall, small flakes carried by the wind so they swirled against the windows and hissed against the stovepipe. I set another log on the fire and stirred the beans, the cabin quiet enough to hear the creak of the rafters. A sound at the door made me pause, not a knock so much as a careful tap, like someone testing whether they should try again. When I looked toward the window, her shape was there, shoulders hunched, hair loose around her face, the lamplight catching on the torn edge of cloth she had tied over her shoulder. I opened the door and she stepped inside without speaking. Her boots wet her cheeks red from the cold. I moved aside, letting her in toward the cot I'd set near the stove. She looked around one's bare shelves. A single table, one chair, and then sat slowly, her hands resting in her lap. I asked if she had eaten, and she shook her head. I filled a tin plate and passed her a spoon. She ate without hurry, keeping her legs together and back straight like she was bracing against something. I stayed by the stove, letting her finish in her own time. When she set the spoon down, her voice was quiet but even. "Name's Calla," she said. I told her mine and she nodded. She made it clear she wasn't here to take or cause trouble, and offered to leave in the morning if I wanted. I told her the snow would be worse by then, and she should stay. She didn't argue, which told me more than any words. After she washed her hands and face at the basin, I noticed the bruise beneath the cloth at her shoulder, dark purple fading at the edges. She caught me looking and said simply, "I left before he got worse." I didn't ask who. The wind rose outside, pushing against the door, and she turned toward the cot without another word. I kept the fire going until it burned low, then lay down on my bed, listening to her steady breathing across the room. By morning, she was already at the stove trying to work the draft. Her hair was pulled back in a rough tie, the same dress hanging loose at the seams. I showed her the vent and how to set the plate so it caught better. She watched close, and when the fire took, a small smile crossed her face. She stayed by the stove most of the morning, cleaning the dishes and folding the blanket she'd used without being asked. At midday, I went to the barn, and when I came back, she was at the table sewing the torn sleeve of her dress with slow, careful stitches. I asked if she could sew, and she said she had to, growing up with 4 sisters. I pulled down an old winter shirt from a peg and asked if she'd try mending it. She nodded without hesitation. The next nights were the same, quiet, steady. She swept the floor, boiled water before I thought to, and worked with her hands while the fire burned. She spoke little of where she'd been or why she'd ended up here, but it didn't feel like she was avoiding anything. It felt more like habit, a long stretch of years where silence was safer. One evening, as we ate by the fire, her leg touched mine under the table. She didn't move it, and neither did I. As the days passed, her mornings began earlier. I'd find her at the basin, with sharp breaths as the cold water hit her face, her shoulders still stiff from the cot. The bruise on her arm faded, and the tremor in her fingers was gone. She folded my shirts without me asking, portioned the beans, before I sat down and tended to the stove when I was out. Sometimes I'd catch her eyes wandering toward the door, not out of fear, but like someone remembering a time when they had to watch for it. One afternoon, while I split kindling behind the cabin, I saw her watching from the kitchen window. She didn't look away when I noticed. Later at the table, we lingered over the last of the salt pork and beans. I asked if someone might be following her. She took a moment before nodding, saying she'd run far, but didn't trust anything. She asked if I wanted her gone before he found her. I told her that if he came here, he'd leave the same way or worse. Her eyes stayed on me a long moment, and then she said his name, Wesley. She'd known him since she was 16, thought she'd marry him until he changed and took things she hadn't agreed to give. I told her she didn't owe me the rest. She nodded but added, "I'm tired of carrying it myself." That night she didn't go to the cot. She stood near the bed, her voice steady. "I'm not asking," she said. "Just don't make me feel small." She lay down still in her dress, her back to me. I stayed by the fire a while, the only sounds the wind outside and the low shift of the logs. When I finally lay beside her, I didn't reach for her, but she shifted closer until her hand brushed mine. By morning she was still there, and when we stepped outside to gather wood, her shoulders were less hunched, her stride more certain. The week held to that new rhythm. The snow kept the land quiet, and the work in the barn slowed enough that I found myself thinking of the cabin and who would be there when I came back. On the 5th morning, she met me at the door with my gloves in hand. She didn't say anything, just passed them over like it was the most natural thing in the world. That evening, we sat shoulder to shoulder by the stove over rabbit stew. She leaned into me for a moment as she adjusted her shawl and didn't move away. We talked in short pieces about the places we'd been. She'd never been farther west than a ranch near Clifton when she was 12. She asked if I ever thought about leaving, and I told her no. Out there was just more people and noise. She nodded, saying she understood. That night she changed behind the curtain, and I caught the faint scars and fading marks along her skin before she slipped into a clean shift. When she stepped toward the bed, she told me I didn't need to hold my breath around her. I touched her hair first, then her face, each movement slow. She unbuttoned my shirt without hurry and when we kissed, it was steady grounding. She eased me back, and when my hands found the curve of her hips, she didn't draw away. We moved together without words, the quilt shifting under us, the firelight catching on her hair. Afterward, she rested her head on my chest, her hands spread against my ribs, breathing slow until sleep took her. In the morning, she was at the stove humming a tune I didn't know. When I asked if she'd slept all right, she turned with a small smile and said she'd stayed warm. By late February, the snow softened to slush, and the cabin felt different, less like a place for one man to get through winter, more like somewhere worth keeping. And that was before either of us knew how soon the past she'd run from would step back into sight. The chill in the air had softened by morning, though the ground was still frozen firm beneath our boots. Calla moved around the cabin with a steadiness I hadn't seen before, her sleeves rolled up as she tended the morning fire and prepared coffee. The bruise on her arm had faded to a dull purple, but her hand still trembled slightly as she worked the wood stove. I watched from the doorway, leaning on my axe handle, the cold air brushing against my coat. She caught my eye, offered a small, tired smile, and for the first time, she didn't seem like someone just holding on by a thread. Days had settled into a rhythm neither of us pushed against. She swept the floor and folded my shirts without a word, portioned the beans, before I sat down and watched the shadows stretch across the cabin walls with quiet patience. Still, sometimes her eyes flickered toward the door, as if expecting the past to step back inside and undo what little peace she'd found. One afternoon, while chopping firewood behind the cabin, I caught her watching me from the kitchen window, the dishcloth draped over one arm, hair falling loose across her cheek. She wasn't hiding, just waiting, or maybe hoping that the ghosts wouldn't come back. The days grew longer, and the snow softened to slush along the barnyard's edges. Calla's dress, once threadbare and patched, now hung cleaner and fit better. She moved with more purpose, carrying herself like someone who belonged to this land. I noticed the way she looked when she thought I wasn't watching, the way her eyes lingered on the ridge, where the trees met the sky, searching for something beyond the hills. She never mentioned Wesley again, but the weight of that silence pressed between us, heavier than the snow that still clung to the fence posts. One evening we sat by the fire longer than usual, the last embers glowing faint against the cabin walls. Calla's hand found mine across the table, and she held it steady. "He's still out there," she said quietly, waiting. I nodded, the lines around my eyes tightening. "If he comes here, he'll find something different." Her gaze met mine, steady and firm for once. "I'm not running this time," she said. The threat outside cast a long shadow, but it didn't darken the cabin. We worked side by side, patching fences and mending the barn gate in silence that spoke louder than words. The land was waking beneath the spring thaw, stubborn green pushing through the mud, and with it, a quiet promise. For the first time since she arrived, Calla didn't flinch when I touched her, didn't pull away when I reached for her hand. There was something steady growing between us, not rushed, not loud, just sure. But the past has a way of catching up in the quiet moments before dusk. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, I spotted a figure moving at the tree line, a dark coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Calla saw him too. Wesley. He hadn't come for talk. That night, the wind carried a low howl, and the cabin held its breath. The morning air still carried a bite, but the sunlight had begun softening the edges of the snowdrifts around the cabin. Calla stood by the kitchen window, sleeves rolled up quietly, scrubbing a rag over the wood table as I finished saddling the bay mare for a ride along the ridge. She glanced up when I came inside and caught my eye, the faintest hint of a smile breaking through. For the first time since she arrived, she looked like she belonged in the frame of that window, not just passing through, but part of the land itself. We ate our breakfast in silence, the quiet between us filled with the occasional creak of the floorboards and the crackling fire. Her movements were measured now, folding laundry, filling water jugs, mending fences alongside me in the cool morning light. The bruise on her arm had faded to a pale yellow, and though her hands still bore the roughness of hard work, the tremor had all but disappeared. There was a steadiness in her step I hadn't seen before, a subtle shift that made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like home. One afternoon, as I worked repairing the fence along the south pasture, I caught her watching from the porch, her gaze lingering on the horizon, where the pines stood tall against the sky. When she saw me looking, she offered a small nod, but said nothing. Later that evening, while we sat shoulder to shoulder by the stove sharing rabbit stew, she reached out and touched my hand, her fingers warm and sure. The moment hung between us quietly unspoken, but full of meaning. She had stopped running, even if the past still cast a long shadow over us both. The nights grew longer and warmer, and the rhythm of our days settled into a steady beat. We worked side by side, fixing what the winter had broken, clearing brush that hadn't been touched in years, and preparing the land for spring. I found myself watching her more often, the way her hair caught the lamplight, the way she smiled softly when she thought no one was looking. I never said it aloud, but the cabin no longer felt empty. Still, the memory of Wesley lingered. There were moments when her eyes darkened, when she paused at the door, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. One evening, as the sun slipped low behind the ridge, I spotted a figure standing at the edge of the trees. A man in a dark coat and wide hat, watching us from the shadows. Calla saw him too. Wesley had come back. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but the tension in the air was as sharp as the wind that rattled the cabin's boards. I stepped beside her, the weight of my Winchester heavy at my side, ready for whatever was to come. There was no turning back now. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pasture as Calla and I worked side by side repairing the barn gate. Her hands were steady, sure as she held the hammer and guided nails into worn planks. The sound of the hammer tapping was steady, rhythmic, like the quiet beat of something finally settling between us. I handed her a nail, and she took it without hesitation, the gesture plain but full of meaning. The barn, weathered from years of storms and neglect, seemed to come alive again under her care. Evenings had grown softer too. We'd sit on the porch as the sky faded from orange to violet, sharing quiet meals by lamplight and talking just enough to fill the spaces between the crickets and the crackling fire. One night, as the wind tugged gently at her shawl, Calla leaned in and kissed me. It was slow, deliberate, a quiet promise, not a desperate plea. Her fingers traced along my arm, and when she slid closer on the bench, I felt the weight of her trust settle deep. It was the first time I saw that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She didn't speak much about Wesley, not since that evening by the fire, when she told me the pieces of her story. But the past never fully leaves. One morning, as I chopped kindling by the stump, I found myself watching her as she scrubbed the rugs over a flat stone. The sun caught her hair just right, and she smiled softly when she noticed me watching. That smile, small and real, was proof enough of the change growing inside her. There was a calm between us, but the shadow of Wesley loomed still. It wasn't long before he came back. Calla saw him first, standing at the edge of the trees, hat pulled low, coat dark against the rising sun. She didn't move, didn't blink. I came up behind her, rifle slung over my shoulder, eyes locked on the man who'd haunted her steps for so long. Wesley's gaze flicked between us, a mix of anger and disbelief writ plain. He thought he still held some claim, some power. But neither of us flinched. I spoke for both of us. This was her home now. If he came again, he'd find nothing but resistance. Calla stepped forward, voice clear and steady, telling him she wasn't his property and that he had lost his chance. His smirk faltered, and after a tense moment, he spat on the ground and turned away. The woods swallowed him up, and I watched until the brush swallowed the last of his figure. That night the cabin felt lighter, but the quiet wasn't just peace. It was victory earned in silence. Calla and I sat on the porch, hands joined, watching the sun dip below the ridge. She told me she wasn't afraid anymore, and I believed her. We had both stopped running. Still, something lingered in the air, the promise that what we built would be tested again. But whatever came next, we would meet it steady and together. The days grew longer as spring crept over the hills, but the promise of warmth came wrapped in a sharp edge of uncertainty. Calla moved about the cabin with the kind of quiet determination I'd come to know, filling water jugs, mending clothes, preparing meals, with steady hands. But the shadow of what might come never fully lifted from her eyes. One morning, as I loaded a pail at the creek, I noticed her standing barefoot on the porch. The hem of her dress caught just above the mud-slicked ground. She was watching the tree line, lips pressed thin, and when I called out, she didn't startle, just turned with a small, steady smile that carried more courage than I'd seen before. That afternoon, while clearing brush near the barn, I caught sight of movement beyond the fence, just a shape dark and still against the tangled pines. Calla's voice held no tremor when she said, "He's out there." The figure didn't show a face, only the tilt of a wide-brimmed hat. I told her to stay inside, lock the doors, and keep close. She gripped my arm and said, "If he tries anything, I won't run." I nodded, knowing the past was coming to test us both. As dusk fell, I took my Winchester and went to patrol the perimeter, the cold wind slicing through my coat. The woods held their silence. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of fire. Whoever had been near was cautious, but the weight of waiting pressed down heavier than the night. When I returned, the cabin was warm and quiet, Calla holding my coat like a shield against the chill. She asked if I was all right. I said nothing, but settled beside her by the fire. Sleep was shallow that night. Every creak of the cabin, every shifting wind outside kept me alert. Calla curled against me, her hand gripping the shirt at my waist like a lifeline. By morning, the tension had dulled, but not lifted. I saw the new steel in her eyes when she said, "I'm not running anymore, even if he comes." I wrapped my arms around her and told her she was home now, not going anywhere unless you want to. She whispered her agreement, and for a moment the cabin felt like the safest place in the world. We rode out together that afternoon, her sitting tall on the buckskin while I followed on my own horse. The silence between us was different, not filled with fear, but a readiness neither of us spoke aloud. We stopped on a ridge overlooking the valley, the wind soft against our faces. She reached out and took my hand, asking if I thought we'd be all right. I nodded, knowing some things were worth standing for, no matter the cost. Her kiss was slow and sure, a quiet promise made beneath the fading light. Then came the day he returned. I was hauling water from the creek when Calla saw him, Wesley, stepping from the brush, his dark coat and hat a shadow against the trees. She didn't flinch. He stood maybe 30 yards off, eyes fixed on her like a man waiting for a challenge. I joined her, the weight of my rifle at my side, jaw set. Wesley's voice was smooth, but carried the edge of old anger, mocking her choice and warning her not to hide behind me. Calla stepped forward, voice clear and steady, telling him he had no claim, no right to follow her anymore. I stood firm, warning him once more if he came again, it wouldn't end well for him. He spat on the ground, casting one last look at Calla before retreating into the trees, swallowed by the growing dusk. We watched until the forest swallowed the last trace of him. That night, the porch held our quiet hands joined beneath the stars. Calla said she wasn't afraid anymore. I believed her because she had stopped running, and standing still was the hardest fight of all. But even as the cabin settled into that fragile peace, the past was not finished with us yet. The day settled slow and warm, the kind of afternoon that makes the shadows lean long and the air hum soft with spring's promise. Calla was out by the creek, sleeves rolled, scrubbing the rugs she'd hung the day before. Her bare feet pressed steady against the cold stones, and the sun caught the fine strands of her hair, making them shine like copper in the light. I watched from the porch, a cup of coffee warming my hands, and for a moment I saw her not as the woman who had come here broken and afraid, but as someone who'd claimed this place, who belonged to it. We ate our breakfast quiet, and the cabin filled with the low crackle of the stove and the occasional chirp of a bird outside. She moved through the small tasks, folding laundry, sweeping floors, tending the fire with a calm that steadied the air. When I pulled an old shirt from the peg for her to patch, she took the needle without hesitation, stitching the worn fabric with slow, sure hands. The bruise on her arm had faded the marks, still there but softened like the past was losing its grip. There was a moment that caught me late afternoon when the light was turning golden. She stepped onto the porch barefoot, the hem of her dress just clear of the mud. Her eyes met mine steady and unafraid. "You ever scare me?" I asked quietly. She smiled faintly and said no, not anymore. "You don't scare me, Jed," she said, her voice soft but sure. That night she kissed me first, slow and deliberate, like she was making a choice she couldn't take back. We sat by the fire afterward, the sky fading to violet and the cabin glowing orange with lamplight. Her hand brushed my arm, and when I followed her to bed, there was no rush or hesitation, just a steady confidence between us. When she slid out of her dress and into my arms, it felt like the slow folding of a wound, healing. Her breath was even, her fingers tracing light patterns along my skin as we moved together in quiet harmony. Afterward, she rested against me, her head on my chest, and told me about a sister she'd lost to fever, a mother who'd passed, and the man she'd run from, Wesley. I didn't speak of Sarah, but the silence between us held both griefs, old and new. When morning came, Calla rose before me and slipped outside to brush down the mare. I found her humming a tune I didn't know the sound light and sure like the woman I'd come to know. The weeks passed with the land stirring to life beneath the thaw. The garden behind the cabin grew green with squash and beans, and Calla's belly began to round softly beneath her dresses. She placed my hand over it, once her smile quiet but wide. When I asked if she was staying, she looked across the fields and said, "I think I always was." No one else came looking. The cabin, once silent, was alive with the sounds of our lives, the low hum of bees, the steady thud of hammer on wood, and the soft whisper of wind through new leaves. What began in a barn on a frozen morning had grown into a home built on steady hands and quiet trust. And for the first time in a long time, I knew she wasn't just surviving. She was living. The cabin had changed just as we had. Where once there was silence heavy as winter's snow, now there was the soft hum of life, the crackle of firewood burning steady, the low call of cattle grazing just beyond the fence, the warm scent of fresh earth and growing things. Calla moved with a calm surety that filled the rooms, her hands steady as she prepared meals and tended the garden. She no longer glanced toward the door with that old, wary look. This place was home. Spring had come full, and with it new life stirred beneath the soil and in our hearts. Calla's belly grew round and soft, quiet promise of the family we were building together. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and painted the sky a gentle orange, she placed my hand on her stomach, her smile small but full of hope. I asked if she was really staying, and she looked out across the fields, her eyes steady. "I think I always was," she said. The past that once chased her had faded like a distant thunderstorm, no longer threatening the calm we had claimed. Wesley never returned. The woods held their secrets, but out here on the open land, there was justice in the quiet strength we shared. It wasn't loud or sudden, it was steady and sure, the kind of justice born from standing tall and refusing to be broken. This journey hadn't been easy. There were nights filled with doubt and days weighed down by fear. But through it all, kindness and resilience carved a path forward. Kala wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Together we found a home, not just in this cabin, but in each other. If there's a lesson I can leave with you, it's this. No matter how far the darkness reaches, there is strength in choosing to stay, to build, and to forgive yourself for the past. True justice isn't always found in courtrooms or loud reckonings. Sometimes it's the quiet rebuilding of a life, the steady hands that mend fences and hearts alike. Thank you for listening to our story. If it touched something in you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're standing at a crossroads, remember sometimes the bravest step is simply to stay and build from where you are.